Good morning and welcome to our webinar, Apprenticeship Standards, 20% off the job training made clear. Thank you for joining us. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to explain a few things about our webinar platform to allow you to get the most out of the experience. All viewers will be in listen-only mode. To engage with the webinar, please use the on-screen panel. You can also adjust your audio settings using the tabs on this panel. Feel free to use the question tab to engage with us during the webinar. We expect our webinar will be extremely popular, but our team will do their best to answer your questions at the end. After the webinar, we will be providing a recording, a copy of the slides, and a Q&A sheet to address any unanswered questions. And now I'd like to hand over to our presenters, Bryony Kingsland, UK Funding Manager, and Kirsten Train-Ward, Digital Product Manager.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our webinar. So first of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about off the job. We've had a few events recently with partner organisations that we've carried out, and being out on the road talking to various employers and providers has made it quite clear that there's still some lack of clarity out there about what off the job is and what can be included and can't be included in off the job. So we'll do just a quick overview of off the job training and what it is. Hang on, if I can get the slide to move on. No, next. There we go. Get that way. Oh, okay. Sorry about that, everybody. Slight technology hitch there. That's nothing unusual in these webinars. Okay, so let's have a look at the definition of the off-the-job training. This is taken directly from some of the funding rules and the technical funding document, and also there is an example off-the-job document that the ESFA has published on the .gov server. I haven't included the link in these slides, but I think we can send that out afterwards because many people don't know that document actually exists. And it's a document that gives some examples of what can be included and can't be included off the job. So, off the job training is basically defined as learning that's undertaken outside of the normal working day environment. So what that means is that the apprentice is not actually doing their job. They are learning the knowledge-based part of an apprenticeship. There's several parts of an apprenticeship. There's obviously the behaviours, there's the skills, which is the more practical aspect of learning inside an apprenticeship, and then there's the knowledge, which is the more taking on information, whether that's via observing somebody or whether it's via classroom-based work. There's lots of different opportunities for apprentices to gain knowledge that needs to be gained as part of an apprenticeship. So it can be delivered inside the apprentice's normal place of work. Off-the-job training can be delivered inside a college. There's various places where they can actually access that knowledge part, the off-the-job part of the apprenticeship. The one thing you need to be aware is it cannot be delivered as part of their normal working duties, so they can't do it when they're normally working. And off-the-job training also doesn't include any training which takes place outside of the apprentice's paid working hours. So it has to be within their normal working hours. Now, we've had some interesting examples given recently, which I'm just going to talk through quickly. One of these examples is some employers who've decided to extend their apprentices' working hours so that they're still getting a full working week from the apprentices, but the apprentice still has to do their off-the-job work, their off-the-job training on top of that. But one of the points in the funding rules states very clearly that the off-the-job training is the percentage. It's 20% off-the-job training is a percentage of the apprentice's paid working hours. So that means if your apprentice generally does a 37.5 hour, 38 hour working week, then 1 day or 7.5 hours per week must be off the job. So that means if the apprentice works longer hours, for instance, if you extend their hours to 45 hours a week, that means the apprentice then has to do 9 hours off the job. So the more hours the apprentice does, the more off the job training they're going to do. So to a certain extent, that extension of the apprentice's working hours is a bit of a self-defeating approach. I also am very aware that the Department for Education and IFA and the ESFA will be watching that very carefully. So I think if they see too much of that sort of approach occurring, then they might put in other funding rules which will address that. So it's something just to be aware of. So the other thing is that any qualifications or extras that are not actually written in an apprenticeship standard or in an apprenticeship framework as mandatory cannot be paid for by the government, and they also cannot be part of the off-the-job training. So, for example, an employer asks for an extra qualification within the delivery of an apprenticeship standard, none of that delivery of that particular qualification can be counted as part of the off-the-job training. It's got to be the mandatory content that's in that apprenticeship standard or in that apprenticeship framework. So I hope that makes that a little bit clearer with regards to what is the definition of off-the-job training. The other thing to be very clear about there is that it doesn't necessarily need to be day release. It can be block release. We go to the next slide. Thanks very much. So you can look at the off-the-job training in the vital 20%. There's lots of different ways that off-the-job training can be delivered. And I think this is where some of the misconception occurs. There are many employers out there that naturally assume that off-the-job training is 1 day a week out of the office with the apprentice in a classroom somewhere or inside the college or training provider's premises. In actual fact, the teaching and theory of lectures, which may occur in a classroom, either inside the employer's premises or inside the college or private training provider's premises, that can occur, and it can occur on a 1 day a week basis if that's what the employer is happy to do. But also, there are various other things that employers might actually include as part of it, particularly if it's a new employee's role, that also count as off-the-job training. So with current employees that are actually upgrading their skills or their knowledge to progress their career inside their employer, this might be slightly more difficult. But if you're a new employee completely, if you think about things like manufacturing training, so if there's new equipment or new technologies that an apprentice needs to learn, and they're going off to do that, to observe that in another department or in another premises belonging to the employer, or even in another employer's or doing something else within another employer or within the sector, that's actually gaining the knowledge and experience, or particularly knowledge, an experience that is relevant to their apprenticeship, that can also be included as off-the-job training. So being shadowing or being mentored, observing other people working in another part of the employer's business, learning supported by the employer provider that's not directly related to the apprentice's everyday work, online learning, sometimes webinars or blended learning, that can all be included in off-the-job training. So providers can really support employers with this by sitting down with them at the very commencement of the apprenticeship and working through with the employer what training the employer is going to do that can actually count as off-the-job. So it doesn't necessarily need to be 1 day a week in a classroom or block release with a provider outside of the employer's premises. So you can see from that list there that's up on the screen in the webinar, there are lots of other options that you can sit down with an employer at the beginning, or an employer can sit down with a provider at the beginning of the apprenticeship and work through what can be added into the 20% that actually achieves that 20% that a lot of people have concerns about at the moment. The other thing I'm very aware of at the moment is a lot of work is going on by various other bodies, like AELP and UBAC, who are lobbying the government for changes to the 20% off-the-job arrangements. We don't know what's going to come from that lobbying yet, but I know that certain issues that are being lobbied, for example, with the higher apprenticeships, are issues such as, with some of the higher apprenticeships and the degree apprenticeships, a lot of study actually takes place outside of the employee's apprenticeship and working hours, because when you're in a higher degree apprenticeship, a lot of self-study is required, and a lot of that occurs in the evening. And there's a view, certainly with the higher level of apprenticeships and the degree apprenticeships, that that should be included as off the job. So it'll be interesting to see where UBAC gets with that bit of lobbying. AELP are also lobbying, I know, along with various other organisations, to have the 20% off the job made relevant to the particular apprenticeship standard. So when a standard is signed off as ready for delivery, the off-the-job training should be what is needed for that particular apprenticeship, that it shouldn't just be 20% off the job right across the board for every different apprenticeship standard, because they're all different, and some apprenticeship standards might actually need more than 20%, and some of them might need slightly less. And at the moment, I think the government is very much sticking to that vital 20% off the job, because their view is it offers quality inside our apprenticeship system. And I think I think and I know actually that for our apprenticeship system and our apprenticeship standards, the future of our apprenticeships, the quality that is going to be increasingly important as we exit Europe and as our own skills needs increase, because we're not able to get skills needs from outside of the UK. It's going to be increasingly important that not only the skills but the knowledge of our employees is also upgraded. And I think that there is a really important aspect of the 20%. Everybody needs to take on board, and the employers need to take on board, that need is strongly a part of making sure we have the workforce for the future for the UK. So I don't think the vital 20% is ever going to disappear. We may get some more flexibility in the future, but it is vital for the quality of our apprenticeships in the future and going forward for the skills of our nation. So it's never going to disappear completely, and I think we just have to accept that it's there, and just together employers and providers can work to make sure that what they're actually doing fully encompasses that whole 20%. So just take a quick look at the next slide, what off-the-job training cannot include, so everybody's also clear about that. Enrolment and induction into the company or into the apprenticeship cannot be included in off-the-job. However, if there is an induction onto the actual apprenticeship itself, which sits down with the apprentice and works through what they're going to be doing for the course of the year, when their learning is, when various parts of their learning is going to take place, that can be included. But induction into the actual company, if it's a new role, cannot be included in the apprenticeship. The diagnostic assessment or prior assessment, so that you're assessing what skills the apprentice needs to learn surrounding that apprenticeship, that's also not included. Maths and English is not included in off the job. That is funded separately anyway, so it's separate from the apprenticeship, even though it might be included in the actual standard or the framework as a definite mandatory requirement. It's not included as off the job. Progress reviews and on-programme assessment needed for the apprenticeship framework or standard, that's not included. And off-the-job training, i.e. training that's only delivered by distance learning, cannot be included. So you can't do an apprenticeship by distance learning is what they're saying. There has to be some face-to-face, there has to be some actual learning and knowledge downloaded from elsewhere. It can't all be done as online. However, online and blended learning as part of an apprenticeship, can be included as off-the-job. And then the final point, which is really important, the training that takes place outside of the apprentice's paid working hours cannot be included as off-the-job. So I hope that clarifies some of the opportunities there for off-the-job and expanding what apprentices can and can't do that you can include in their off-the-job training, work through with employers working through with the providers to actually recognise what off-the-job training is taking place that's not inside a classroom. I hope that clarifies some of that. And now I'm just going to pass through to Kirsten Train Ward, who is our
Digital Product Manager. Morning, everyone. So one of the digital products I look after is the Learning Assistant, which is the e-portfolio that we have at City and Guilds. It is the functionality behind Learning Assistant sits behind some of our other delivery platforms. So what I'm going to cover today would be available through any of the delivery platforms that we use, and going forward, this is obviously a moving beast that we are working with and will continue to change based on customer feedback and feedback we get from the regulators and the teams that we work with. So within the Learning Assistant platform, it's pretty easy to record the on-the-job and off-the-job training, and it's available in the system now. This allows the apprentice or assessor to create a contact diary, which is our audit trail that lives inside Learning Assistant, where all contact is put in, and then any regulator or anyone who needs to go check anything can run an audit through the contact diaries. The diary entries are date stamped and carry electronic signatures, so you can see who recorded it, what they've recorded, carries various amounts of detail. The details vary up to how you want to put it into the system, as long as short as you require. It allows you to upload any kind of evidence to show what has been done in the training itself, and allows you to record the hours. What's really important, and something we got a lot of feedback from the ESFA and the other regulators that we work with, is that recording this kind of detail is really important. However, it's the acknowledgements from the other people within the apprenticeship that count. So on what you can see on the screen now, Anna Clark, who is the assessor, she's put the details in about what the training, what has occurred, and has asked the learner to acknowledge it, as well as the company or the employer to acknowledge it. So there's some sort of validation behind what's been recorded as far as the on-the-job and off-the-job training goes. And that's been quite a popular feature throughout the system. Obviously, recording everything is wonderful and great, and adding this evidence into a portfolio is fantastic, but what you would want to do is be able to easily report on it. And within Learning Assistant, you can either do that on an individual learner basis, so that's the screenshot you have at the moment, where you can record and run a report to see exactly how many hours of on-the-job and off-the-job training has occurred. You can also run reports based across a whole cohort of learners. For example, those reports can be pulled down into a batch file that you can upload into any other funding systems that you might want to work with, or we obviously have integrations with different platforms like MIS systems and so on and so forth. So that's it from the Learning Assistant side, how you can record on-the-job, off-the-job training. Pretty simple with all the details you need to add in.
Okay, there's a few links there that might be useful for you, but just to talk about the audit and compliance of the 20% off the job, to finish up with what Kirsten was saying. Recent discussions that I've had with both Ofsted and ESFA, there have been a lot of people asking the question, are Ofsted actually going to audit the 20% off the job? And talking to Paul Joyce, who's a contact of mine within Ofsted, who specialises in apprenticeships, Paul has said that Ofsted have no intention of actually auditing the amount of off the job that occurs. So they won't be auditing that the providers are delivering the 20%. What they will be auditing is the quality of the 20% off the job delivery. So they'll be looking at the quality of that delivery inside of the apprenticeship standard or framework. And it will be the ESFA that will do the audit of the 20% to make sure that you are actually meeting the 20% requirement. So what Learning Assistant enables you to do is actually monitor and provide evidence to the ESFA that you as a provider or the employer with the apprentice are actually achieving that 20% minimum. So that's where Learning Assistant comes into its own there. But it will be the ESFA that will want to look at that evidence trail and that audit trail with you rather than Ofsted. They'll be looking at the quality of the 20% that you're delivering.
Brilliant, thank you very much both. We've finished slightly ahead of schedule, but we've now got time for a 50-minute question and answer section. If you'd be kind enough to put any questions you have into the question tab, we'll get them up on screen and we can answer them for you very shortly. So just type the questions you have into the questions tab.
Okay, so we've got one question here. We've got a couple of people saying they've got no sound, so apologies for that. Most people seem to have had sound. That doesn't seem to be of an issue. The first question we've got here that's coming up is, if a learner on a level 4 does an HNC as part of the apprenticeship, then they spend a day at college, which represents 20%. When do they do the assessment work when the HNC has taken up the 20%? It will very much depend, Mike, on whether that HNC is mandatory within the standard or within the framework. So if that qualification is a mandatory part of the apprenticeship standard or the apprenticeship framework, then you can use that to log as 20% off the job learning if they're doing day release to actually do part of that, or you're doing that HNC in other ways. That means they're not actually sitting at their desk or sitting at their workstation doing their job. I hope that answers the question. If it's not mandatory, you cannot count anything of the HNC as part of the off the job. So you would have to do, so if they are doing the HNC on day release, but it's not a mandatory part, then it still means that that 20% has got to take place as well. So you would actually have other time when the apprentice has got to be away from their workstation doing the other part of the 20% off the job as well. So that's definitely a discussion to have with your employer at the commencement, to let them know that the HNC wouldn't count. There's still another time they'd have to have away from their work desk, which some employers might find a bit of a challenge, I understand. Can functional skills be used as part of the 20%? No, it can't, Jean, I'm afraid. The maths and English, or the functional skills maths and English, is totally separate and has to be delivered separate from the apprenticeship, so it can't form part of the 20%. What about revision time? It does depend, I guess, whether the apprentice is doing it within their working hours. If the employer is willing to give revision time so the apprentice can go through the knowledge part of their learning, the apprentice to get ready for EPA, for example, but they're doing that within working hours, then yes, that would be counted as potentially as 20% off the job. What about practicing skills? If the learner is practicing skills, they're not doing it at their workplace or their work desk or their workstation, and they're practicing something as part of readiness for EPA or just to get more knowledge about that part of their apprenticeship, then yes, that could be counted as off the job. Does online assessment count? I think it would be, I think assessment and review of the skills of the apprentice does generally not count towards 20%. Because that's part of the progress review aspect of the apprenticeship, so I would say no, online assessment wouldn't count. And how about preparation for endpoint assessment? I think that comes into revision time. So if the apprentice is going through practice papers, or if they're revising the knowledge they've already gained in the apprenticeship to make sure they're fully up to speed and and they understand it all and know it all, then yes, that can count towards 20%. Again, it has to happen within working hours. It can't happen outside of working hours. 5. In terms of shadowing and mentoring, does this need to be structured around a subject and documented? Yes, it would. It would need to be shadowing and mentoring that was part of the apprenticeship standard. So you need to look at the content of the apprenticeship standard, make sure it was relevant to the apprenticeship standard or the framework, and you would have to document it in some way. I mean, using Learning Assistant, as Kirsten has just flagged, is a very good way of doing that. So you could actually monitor, you can use videos, there's all sorts of ways you can monitor shadowing and mentoring, or you could get the apprentice to write up a one-page document of what they'd learned and what they'd observed whilst they were shadowing and observing, and then upload that to Learning Assistant or use that in the learner's portfolio. Site inductions to start new, but do we have a right to record TQT and GLH? No, you don't have to record TQT and GLH, because an apprenticeship standard and framework now, because you're now negotiating with the employer for the whole cost of the apprenticeship standard or framework. That covers any guided learning hours or TQT that you might be doing. So basically, the amount that you negotiate with the employer covers the full cost of the apprenticeship, and that includes any mandatory qualifications that are included in those apprenticeships, regardless of whether it's a framework or a standard. So sorry, I'm just going to take a sip of water, everybody, because I'm a bit sore-throated today and a bit dry.
Can I ask a quick question based on something someone else said? So you mentioned about the EPA, getting ready for EPA is important. So we have a tool that we're looking to do. It's around preparing the person to do that EPA. So say part of the EPA was doing a presentation and interview. If they were learning how to do presentation skills, would that be allowed to, and it was done within the working hours, would that count?
If that's a requirement of the endpoint assessment, and obviously therefore it would be a requirement of the apprenticeship standard, then yes, that can count.
Okay.
So it's got to be relevant to the standard, it's got to be relevant to the content of the standard or framework. So if part of EPA is they've got to do a presentation, then yes, you've got to have the skills to do a presentation, so you're learning new skills. So yes, that could count towards off the job preparation. Site inductions to start new builds. I'm presuming, Andrew, that you're talking about a construction style apprenticeship. That is a very good question, and I'm not going to say that I know the answer to that, but what we will do is we'll log that. I'll ask my contact at the ESFA, and we'll find out and we'll answer that in the list of questions that we put up on the website afterwards. Some employers don't offer skills like air conditioning or hybrid. Can they contact the training provider? Will the provider be paid by the government or employer for running these short courses? I think it depends again, Anisu, whether that learning and knowledge is required within the apprenticeship standard. If, for instance, air conditioning was required within the apprenticeship standard, then and the employer wanted a short course and it mapped to the apprenticeship standard or framework, then yes, the provider's not paid by the government, the provider's now paid by the employer, or if it's an SME that's not drawing down levy, then obviously it's 90% is paid for by the government. It all comes down to what you negotiate as that initial price of the apprenticeship between the employer and the provider. So if, for example, an employer-provider agreed that as part of the apprenticeship, air conditioning or hybrid is going to be included, and the employer's it's going to be included, it's in the standard as part of the standard requirement, and it's paid for as part of that initial negotiation of price, then yes, you can include it. And if it's a short course and it's away from their desk or away from their workplace, then yes, you can include that as off the job. I think we've answered the one about functional skills and ICT. Oh, functional skills ICT. Again, Linda Adams is this asking that question. Linda, it depends whether ICT is included in the apprenticeship standard. Basically, if something is written into the apprenticeship standard or it's included in the apprenticeship framework and they're not doing it at their desk or they're in a classroom doing it and they're away from their workplace and it's within their working hours, that can be included in 20% off the job. But it has to be written into the standard. It's got to be a mandatory part of the standard or a mandatory part of that apprenticeship framework. If an apprentice attends an industry event at weekends, can this be counted off the job? Yes, if the apprentice is given in time off in lieu because of that attendance, yes, it can be counted as 20%. And actually in that example document that ESFA has published on .gov that we'll give you the link to in the questions, it actually gives an example of an apprentice attending a weekend event, being given time off in lieu, and that counting towards their 20%. But obviously you'd have to evidence that, so you'd want the attendance and the ticket and and then to do a write-up of what they actually learnt at that industry event. Can I just confirm what you said in the induction, please? So induction to the company cannot count, but induction to their apprenticeship could count. So when I say induction to apprenticeship, it does depend what you're doing as part of that apprenticeship induction. So induction to the company does not count, but if you're actually introducing the apprentice to what they're going to be doing, you're sitting down working out their plan for the apprenticeship throughout the year, when they're going to be assessed, when they're going to be met, what they're going to do, that can count towards the 20% off the job. What if the employer is doing, where are the ESFA guidelines and auditing of the 20% off the job? The ESFA has just published how they're going to monitor the funding rules. It's a new document that's literally come out in the last couple of weeks. So I include that link in the questions document that we put out on the website at the end. What if the employer is doing the off the job? Does he evidence it, or the platform? If the employer is doing the off the job?
I think that's okay. So I think that's a learning system question. So that's from Graham. So if the employer was doing part of the off the job training, so they were supplying it, within Learning Assistant and any of our delivery platforms that we have, they should be able to access it themselves through their own logins. They'll be able to put the contact diary in exactly the same way, upload any evidence into the contact diary. You would obviously give them guidance on how this would work best. And again, they can ask for the acknowledgement of both the tutor and the learner to say, I've uploaded this, I've put these many hours, so everyone's agreed that those hours are valid. So I've answered your question, Graham.
Okay, so will the ESFA audit level 7 apprenticeship evidence as well? No, Amy, the ESFA only audits apprenticeships up to level 5, I think. So the higher level apprenticeships, the higher education institutes and university degrees, degree apprenticeships, they're going to be audited and monitored in a different way, and that will be by individual universities or individual HEIs, so that's a different arrangement. ESFA does the audits, I think, up to level 4 and 5, and I think that's as far as they go. I'll double check what level the ESFA stops at, and the higher education institutes and apprentices take, degree apprenticeship universities take over. We'll put that in the answer to the questions. We've answered that one already. What if the employer does not allow the employee to do the 20%? Amy Williams, if the employer does not allow the employer to do the 20%, you will not be able to run that apprenticeship, or you shouldn't run that apprenticeship. If an employer is not prepared to fully engage in the apprenticeship process and including the 20%, you as the provider will be the one that loses the funding. So you would have your funding removed by the ESFA, but also you'll fail your Ofsted because Ofsted won't consider it to be a quality apprenticeship once they see you're not doing the 20%, and it's more than possible that the ESFA might decide to remove your apprenticeship contract. So I would not advise working with any employer that's not prepared to engage in that 20% off the job, because they're really not that serious about apprenticeship, so they should be looking at other routes to potentially get their employees upskilled. What is near the job guided learning? Near the job? That's a good question, Kaylee. I'm not quite sure I even know what near the job guided learning is. I've not heard that expression before. You might want to contact us with a bit more detail about that, or it might be a conversation to maybe have with your ESFA partnership manager. But I think we need to know a little bit more about near the job before we could give you any guidance on that at all. So if you want to contact us outside of the webinar, we can have a conversation and see whether we can support you on that. Is the 20% off the job applicable to MBA apprenticeship too? It's applicable to all apprenticeships, but you might want to check your MBA apprenticeship standard and see what's written into that. But as far as the government concerns, every single apprenticeship, if it's an apprenticeship, there should be 20% off the job. Can you backdate the contact diary to record training? Kirsten?
No, you can't. Part of the rules we need to have within Learning Assistant to meet our regulatory requirements is that the dates are date stamped, so they're recorded or when they're actually created. Now, some centres do create something in slightly later than when it actually took place, and we would usually recommend that you highlight that in the contact diary and say, although I'm recording this on the 14th of December, the training took place on the 9th of December, and then there's obviously reasons behind that, and that's usually fine. So it's about putting the quality detail into the diary entry that really counts, so that values it, not just putting the time in, if that makes any more sense.
It says, what records do we need to keep off the job if we don't use Learning Assistant? Well, It explains quite clearly in the funding rules and in the off-the-job document what sort of information you need to. There's also an audit document that we'll put a link to the ESFA audit document as well, which gives you some idea about what you should be delivering. But the reality is you have to prove to the ESFA that you are delivering off-the-job training. So it needs to be validated by the employer, the provider, and by the learner. So some sort of document, whether it's a hard document as part of the apprentice's portfolio, or whether it's part of the evidence pack, and there is an evidence pack that the ESFA require providers to have for every single learner, and that evidence pack is quite comprehensive, and in that you'd have all the evidence about what learning the apprentice is actually doing as part of their apprenticeship. And the audit document and the funding rules make very clear what that evidence pack contents and requirements are. I have got some slides I produced for that are a sort of a well, not a vague, a pretty thorough overview of the evidence pack requirements. We could potentially include them in the answers document. We can do a link to them. We can do a link to those slides that I produced about the evidence, so we'll put a link into them as well. Who can access reports for guided learning hours on Learning Assistant?
Okay, so you've got if it's accessible by tutors, IQAs, and managers. So the report that I showed you on the screen, that's available to anyone who has access to that learner's portfolio. As a centre, you decide who has that access. So the tutors and IQAs and managers who are associated with those learners will be able to see that report. The cohort report is usually run by the administrators, but those can be emailed and shared out by scheduling those reports. If you want to know more information, Julie, the digital support team and the digital solution managers can give you some demos and examples of how that could work.
Okay, so one of the previous slides you mentioned review of progress as being outside of 20%. Please can we give more detail on that? For every single apprenticeship, Ofsted and ESFA and everyone else basically assumes that there's going to be a review of where the apprentice is within their apprenticeship, carried out by the provider and potentially the employer involved in this as well, to see where they are and how much learning has still got to take place. And those learning reviews should take place fairly regularly. Generally, they take place with most apprenticeships every sort of 6 to 8 weeks, where you sit down and you go through what the apprentice has learned, where they are, make sure that you're verifying their learning. That cannot include those progress reviews, which are a mandatory part of any apprenticeship, cannot be included in the 20% off the job. Even though the apprentice might be sitting in a room with you and not doing their job, they don't contribute to that 20% because they're not gaining any knowledge. What they're doing with you is actually just confirming the knowledge that they've got and confirming that they have carried out the work and the projects that you've set for them as part of their apprenticeship. So it's the whole thing about 20% is it's about gaining more knowledge. So the next question, which talks about induction, if you're just filling in forms with an apprenticeship and you count that as induction, the apprentice isn't gaining anything about that. They're not gaining any knowledge or any input that's going to improve their knowledge and skills as part of the apprenticeship. So the induction part of the apprentice, if you're doing preparing the apprentice for actually learning, you're taking them through what they're going to do that's outside of form filling, that can count. So if you're in a room with the apprentice, as part of their induction, you sit down, you take them through when they're going to learn, you take them through what projects they're going to do, you talk through those projects and you prepare them basically for their learning and what they've got to learn, that can count if you're doing that as induction. If induction is just filling in the form to set them up for the apprenticeship, that cannot count towards it. So do observations and professional discussions count towards the job? Off the job hours. Professional discussion, if it's away from their workplace or their workstation or their desk, yes. If you're observing them, if you're observing the apprentice rather than them observing someone else, and they're actually doing their job and you're observing them doing their job, I'm not sure that would count to off the job, but I will check that and we'll come back with an answer because I'm not completely clear on that. Do we get a copy of these slides? Mm-hmm. They will be available on the website after we've put everything up, along with the Q&A document that we will do as well. Are there any templates for recording the 20% off the job? No. The ESFA doesn't provide any templates for this. It's very much down to the provider and the employer to produce templates which they think fully evidence the requirements of the job for the ESFA to see. And I think we talked earlier on about making sure that that's verified with both the employer and the provider and the apprentice, and they've all signed them off. everybody, we're literally coming to the end of our 30 minutes now, I'm afraid. We've actually gone slightly over. We've got loads and loads of questions still to answer, so we'll try and batch them into various answers to make sure we're not repeating ourselves, and they'll be in the Q&A document that we put out with the slides in the next 24, 48 hours.
We'll empty, yeah. We'll be emailing you all with details, links to recording, Q&As. So I'd like to say thank you very much to our presenters, Bryony and Kirsten, and thank you very much for attending, and we hope to see you at another webinar shortly.
Thanks everybody, I hope that was helpful.